In addition to my statement, I would like to say this has been a very difficult week.
There are some Hollywood stories that fade with time. And then there are stories that refuse to die. For more than 4 decades, One Night at Sea has remained one of Hollywood's darkest mysteries. A beautiful movie star was dead. 3 men were left behind. And one of those men was Christopher Walken. At the time, Walken was already becoming one of Hollywood's most unusual and respected actors. But on November 29, 1981, he became connected forever to something far darker than any movie role. That night, Natalie Wood disappeared from a yacht near Catalina Island. Hours later, her body was found floating in the cold Pacific Ocean. She was only 43 years old, and Christopher Walken was one of the last people known to have seen her alive. For decades, Walken rarely spoke about it. When he did, his answers were short, careful, sometimes almost uncomfortable. And that silence only created more questions. Because there were only 4 people aboard the yacht that night. Natalie Wood, her husband, Robert Wagner, Christopher Walken, and the boat's captain, Dennis Davern. One woman would never return, and the stories about what happened afterward would never completely agree. But before we get to the mystery, we need to understand why Christopher Walken was even on that boat. Because the relationship between Walken and Natalie Wood was not just a random Hollywood friendship. They were working together on a movie called Brainstorm. Wood was the established star. Walken was the younger actor whose strange voice, intense eyes, and unpredictable performances were beginning to make Hollywood take notice. The two had spent a great deal of time together during filming. And over Thanksgiving weekend in 1981, Wood invited Walken aboard the family yacht, the Splendor, near Catalina Island. Her husband Robert Wagner was there. So was Captain Dennis Davern. At first, it was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. A few drinks, dinner, friends, and a break from Hollywood. But by the end of the weekend, the trip would become one of the most talked about mysteries in entertainment history. That evening, the group went to dinner. Alcohol was involved. They eventually returned to the yacht. And according to accounts from the night, tension began building. One major point of disagreement involved Walken and Wagner. Wagner later said their argument was about Natalie Wood's career. Walken believed an actor had to give everything to the work. Wagner, as her husband, saw things differently. The discussion became heated. At one point, Wagner later acknowledged that he smashed a wine bottle on the table. But this is where the story becomes complicated. Because the people who were there did not tell exactly the same story. And the differences would become more important as the years passed. According to Wagner's later account, the argument eventually ended. Walken went to his room. Natalie went toward her own cabin. And Wagner believed everything had calmed down. But sometime around midnight, something happened. Natalie Wood was gone. So was the yacht's small inflatable dinghy. At first, the assumption was that she had gone ashore. But that explanation immediately raised questions. Why would Natalie Wood leave a large yacht in the middle of the night? Why would she go into dark, rough water? And why was she wearing a nightgown, socks, and a red jacket? The official conclusion in 1981 was that Wood accidentally drowned. The theory was that she had gone outside because the dinghy was banging against the side of the yacht. While attempting to secure or board it, she slipped and fell into the water. Her body was discovered the next morning. The initial ruling was accidental drowning. For many people, that should have been the end. But it wasn't, because Natalie Wood was famously afraid of dark water. And the circumstances surrounding her final hours never felt completely satisfying to everyone. Then came another problem. The stories changed. Captain Dennis Davern eventually became one of the most important voices in the controversy. Years later, he claimed that there had been a serious argument between Wagner and Wood. He also suggested that what happened aboard the yacht was more disturbing than the original account indicated. Those allegations helped push the case back into the public spotlight decades later. In 2011, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the investigation after receiving new information. And suddenly, the question returned. What really happened on the Splendor? But there was one person everyone wanted to hear from. Christopher Walken. Because Walken was there. He knew Natalie. He knew Wagner. And he was aboard the yacht during the final hours of Natalie's life. Yet Walken never offered the explosive confession people wanted. In fact, his statements were remarkably consistent. Years after Wood's death, Walken said he did not know exactly what happened. In a 1997 interview, he explained that only Natalie knew what happened because she was alone when she went outside. And that sentence became one of the most haunting parts of the entire story. Only she knows. Think about that. For decades, people have searched for clues. They have examined the yacht, studied the weather, revisited the timeline, questioned witnesses, analyzed the injuries, and debated every detail. But the one person who could have answered the most important question was the person who never came back. Natalie Wood. And that left everyone else trying to reconstruct a night they could never fully see. Walken's own explanation was simple. He said Wood had gone to bed. He was in his room. He did not witness her fall. And he believed she had gone outside because of the dinghy. In another interview, Walken reportedly described her death as an accident and said he was in bed when it happened. That may sound unsatisfying, but it is important to separate what Walken actually said from what people later imagined he might have known. Because there is no verified evidence that Christopher Walken has publicly confessed to causing Natalie Wood's death. There is no reliable evidence that he suddenly revealed a secret confession at age 83. What he has done is repeatedly maintain that he did not know exactly how she entered the water. And strangely enough, that may be what makes the story even more haunting. Because Walken wasn't simply a distant Hollywood celebrity hearing about a tragedy. He was physically there. He was one of the last people around Natalie Wood. And he had to continue living with that night long after the headlines disappeared. There was a time when Sara Gilbert seemed almost impossible to knock down. She became famous as a teenager. She grew up in front of millions of viewers. She helped create a daytime television show that lasted for 14 seasons. Then she helped bring one of television's biggest sitcoms back from the dead. But today, the headlines tell a very different story. The show she helped revive is gone. Her marriage ended. Her former co-star publicly blamed her for destroying everything. And the television franchise she spent years building has finally come to an end. So naturally, people started asking the same question. What happened to Sara Gilbert? Because from the outside, it looks like everything is falling apart. But there is one problem with that story. It isn't really true. In fact, when you look at Sara's entire journey, what appears to be a downfall may actually be one of the most successful reinventions in television history. And the reason becomes clear when you go back to where everything started. Sara Rebecca Gilbert was born in Santa Monica, California, in 1975. She grew up around show business. Her half-sister was Melissa Gilbert, the star of Little House on the Prairie, while her half-brother Jonathan Gilbert also became an actor. So Hollywood was never some distant dream. It was already part of her family. But Sara didn't simply become an actress because everyone around her was doing it. According to the family story she has shared over the years, she decided at only 6 years old that she wanted to act. And she actually took action. She wrote to agents. Think about that. Most 6-year-olds are worried about cartoons, toys, and school. Sara was already thinking about her future. And only a few years later, that decision would change her life. At 13, she landed the role that would make her famous. Darlene Connor on Roseanne. The character was different from the typical teenage girls television audiences were used to seeing. Darlene wasn't overly cheerful. She wasn't polished. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was sarcastic, intelligent, sometimes angry, and completely unimpressed with the world around her. And audiences loved her. Roseanne became one of the biggest shows on American television. It ran from 1988 to 1997 and became known for showing working-class family life in a way television rarely did at the time. The Connors argued. They struggled with money. They dealt with ordinary problems. But underneath all of it was a family that genuinely loved one another. And right in the middle of that family was Sara Gilbert. She grew up on the show. Millions of people watched her become an adult. And unlike many child stars, Sara avoided the dramatic public collapse that often followed early fame. She kept working. She stayed focused. And she even continued her education. She attended Yale University and graduated in 1997. That detail says a lot about her. Because while Hollywood had already given her fame, she clearly wanted something beyond simply being famous. Then came another part of her life that would become important years later. During the 1990s, Sara was navigating her identity while working in an industry where being openly gay could still carry serious professional risks. She eventually came out publicly as a gay woman. She didn't turn it into a publicity stunt. She simply lived honestly. She built a family. She became a mother. And over time, her private life became another example of how far she had moved beyond the teenage girl audiences first knew as Darlene. But the biggest transformation in her career was still ahead. Because Sara Gilbert wasn't satisfied with simply being an actress. She wanted to build television herself. In 2010, she helped create The Talk. And this wasn't just another acting job. She helped develop the show. She became an executive producer. She sat at the table as a co-host. And what began as a daytime panel show eventually became a television institution. The Talk lasted 14 seasons. It won a Daytime Emmy. And for more than a decade, Sara was involved in one of the most recognizable daytime programs in America. That alone should have changed the way people viewed her career. She wasn't just the former child actress from Roseanne anymore. She was a producer, a creator, a television decision maker. But then something happened that would bring her back to the character that started everything. Darlene Connor. During an episode of The Talk, Sara took part in a sketch that brought Darlene back. John Goodman appeared as Dan Connor. It was supposed to be a fun reunion. But something much bigger came from it. The idea of bringing Roseanne back suddenly became real. Sara became one of the people pushing the revival forward. And in 2018, after more than 2 decades away, Roseanne returned. The result shocked television. The premiere attracted around 20 million viewers. It became the most watched television show in America. The revival was an enormous success. And Sara wasn't just acting in it. She was an executive producer. She had helped bring the machine back to life. For a moment, it looked like she had pulled off the impossible. A show from the 1980s had returned and immediately become one of the biggest programs on television. But then, on May 29, 2018, everything changed. In a single afternoon,